So plants don't always reproduce sexually every time. In fact, asexual reproduction can have its own advantages. This is often, so asexual reproduction is going to produce a new individual without doing the fusion of egg and sperm. And there's a few different ways that plants can do this. Fragmentation is where you take some part of the parent plant and a piece of that comes off and can develop into a whole new plant. So for example, potatoes, if you take a piece of a potato with an eye on it and then plant it, it can grow into an entire potato plant. Adventitious shoots, so you can see the aspen trees down here. The trees that are the same color are actually clones of each other. That's one individual. And the roots grow sideways under the ground and then shoot up into new tree branches that become individual tree trunks. And then apomixis, this actually means away from mixing. So this is the opposite of sexual reproduction. This is the development of seeds that are going to be spread out through asexual reproduction. So you can see this dandelion down here, and the seeds on each of these little white umbrellas is actually made through asexual reproduction. So why do this? Asexual reproduction is cheaper as far as the amount of energy that the plant has to put into reproduction, because flowers and fruits and seeds, they're very expensive. So if I don't want to spend the energy making a big flower and fruit, I can make an asexual seed and then spread my individual self away. If in the case of things like fragmentation or plantlets, vegetative reproduction starts with something that already has leaves and potentially even roots. So this is going to start as a seedling rather than a seed. And so these seedlings are going to be more resilient to the environment rather than a seed, which is really fragile. If the environment is stable, this is great because I don't need a pollinator. I don't have to rely on any other species. It makes cloning, it can happen really quickly without very much energy. The big caveat, the biggest disadvantage, is that there's no genetic variation. This is going to increase the same number of the same individual by cloning. And so if the environment is really stable and there's no environmental change, asexual reproduction might be awesome because you can reproduce really quickly for very cheap. But in a world where there might be a changing environment, because there's humans on your planet, this could be a problem, especially if you don't have the genetic variation to deal with catastrophic forest fires in California or Australia, massive hurricanes hitting your state, or other just really high global temperatures, things like that. So in a world of environmental change, genetic variation is much more advantageous than saving a little bit of energy on fruits and flowers. Plants typically go to efforts to prevent self-fertilization. So if they're going to reproduce sexually, they want to do so with a different individual and not with themselves. So a plant with a complete flower, meaning they have stamens and carpels, could potentially mate with themselves. And they don't want to do that because that's going to minimize their genetic variability. So some species are dioecious, di means two. So this basically means that they have two gendered flowers. So there are flowers that are only male stamens and then flowers that are only female carpels. And that way each individual can't actually mate with itself. It has to mate with a separate plant. Sometimes a flower is complete, but the stamens and the carpels mature at different times based on, or the stamens and the carpels are placed far apart from each other so that they are structurally far apart. The most common method is called self-incompatibility, and this is going to be based on its genotypes using something called the S genes. And so basically this allows the plant to recognize if a pollen has the same genes as itself, and if it does, it will reject the pollination and fertilization from that pollen It won't form a pollen tube, it won't fertilize because it's too similar to itself. So there's two methods of S gene incompatibility, and I'll talk you through an example of each of these. The first one is called gametophytic self-incompatibility. So let's say we have a parent plant, and the genotype of the parent is they have the S1 gene and S2 allele. So this is their genotype. S1 is an allele, S2 is an allele. So when they make a pollen grain, remember they're going to do meiosis. So the pollen is either going to have the gene S1 or it's going to have the gene S2. In gametophytic, let's say this pollen grain lands on a flower. All right, so here's a flower. And this flower has the gene S1, S2. So if this pollen lands here, that S1 matches this S1, it's going to say, no way, we cannot fertilize here. This S2 comes and lands on this flower, and you see S2 matches this flower's S2. It's recognizing that gamete, and it's not going to be able to land there. Let's say there's a different flower, so this is on a different plant, and this one has the S2, S3 genotype. Well, S2 lands here, S2, it matches S2, this can't fertilize. The S1, however, that doesn't match either of the S alleles, right? So S1 from the parent doesn't match S2 or S3 from these. So this is a go. This S1 pollen is going to be able to fertilize the S2, S3 flower. So that's the example of gametophytic self-incompatibility. All right, so now let's look at sporophytic. So sporophytic takes into account the entire genotype of the parent. It doesn't matter which gamete it produces in the pollen grain. So instead, it looks at the spore wall of the pollen grain because that's going to have both of the parent genes in it. So in sporophytic, if either of the flower genes matches either of the parent genes, then it's going to reject that pollination. So when this pollen tries to pollinate the S1, S2 flower, those both match. So that's going to be a big no. That's not going to happen. And when this pollen tries to pollinate this flower with S2, S3, because the S2 matches this S2, it's going to completely reject the pollen. Whether the pollen has an S1 or an S2 in it, it doesn't matter. So this is sporophytic. So sporophytic is going to be more exclusive, meaning it's going to reject more potential mates than gametophytic. Plants often have cells that are called totipotent cells. And when you break this word down, this is toti for total and potent for potential, meaning that these are stem cells that can divide asexually through mitosis and then clone themselves into a completely new individual. So this is one way of asexual reproduction. So this is typically happening with the beginning of this starting what's called a callus. And you can see up here, this is a callus of undifferentiated cells, and they're going to start to divide and then differentiate and then eventually become parts of the shoots. You can see little green leaves, and then you can see little root structures developing on the bottom. And then this is the fully matured cells are now divided into roots and shoots and can develop into a new individual. If a shoot is cut and it includes a node, like an eye on a potato, it typically doesn't need to form a callus because those nodes can develop into a stem and roots fairly easily. One other method of kind of growing plants is called grafting. So this is grafting, where you take two different types of plants and you grow them together. So the stalk is the plant that provides the roots. So in this case, this plant down here is the stalk. And then the scion is the plant that is grafted into it. So you would do this by taking a shoot cutting of the scion, cutting into the stem of the stalk, and then putting this in here. And what happens is in this location, the plants form a callus. And then those undifferentiated cells grow together to create one plant. And this is beneficial if you're maybe you own a vineyard and you're growing wine and you have grapes that make really great wine, but you want to graft those onto a plant with roots that are maybe really resistant to pathogens. So not only do you have good wine, but you have good yields. The totipotent tissue is also super convenient for genetic modifications because I can take a small amount of potential tissue from a plant and do genetic modifications on a few cells and then allow those cells to grow and differentiate into an entire organism with all of the genetic modifications that we just put into it.